President Biden with the Pope, a deeply personal and spiritual moment for the US's second ever Catholic president, but also a chance to discuss the most pressing issues. At the top of the list, the climate emergency. The Biden administration had hoped by now to have passed its massive spending legislation, giving the president the ability to match his words on climate with action. But there's been no breakthrough. As the US president toured Rome with his motorcade of 85 vehicles, the UN Secretary-General said all roads to success at the climate conference in Glasgow in just a few days pass through Rome. What is the minimum G20 countries must deliver at this summit for there to be a chance of a success at COP26 in Glasgow?
We are still above what the scientists tell us that are the levels of emission that should be needed in 2030 and in 2050. And it is clear that it leads nowhere if developed countries will try to blame emerging economies and emerging economies will try to blame developed countries. This is the moment for everybody to do the maximum.
G20 leaders have been arriving in the Italian capital, including some like the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison and the Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who face the most criticism from climate campaigners. A senior UN source has told me that the pre-summit negotiations conducted by the leaders' envoys, known as Sherpas, have been extremely difficult. There's been some positive movement on the global distribution of COVID-19 vaccinations, but on the key issue, the climate emergency, there's been absolutely no progress. Another issue complicating things is the fact that some leaders, notably Russia's President Putin and China's President Xi, will not be travelling to Rome or Glasgow and will be attending this G20 remotely.
You've probably heard there's a make or break UN climate summit happening in Glasgow. It's called COP26. COP what? Well, COP stands for Conference of the Parties. The parties are the nations of the world. And this is the 26th time they've met, COP26. And yes, that is Angela Merkel chairing the first COP summit in 1995. You see, scientists knew way back what we were doing to our planet. So what's new? And why are we still talking about it? Well, nearly 3 decades on from COP1, and yep, everyone's still arguing the toss as to how to deal with just the greatest threat humanity has ever faced. To quote a famous youth activist, all it is blah, 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 blah. So what actually needs to get done? Well, in 2015 in Paris, nations agreed to keep temperature increases well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, ideally 1.5 degrees. But right now, we're already at 1.1 degrees, and it's rising. The world is way behind on commitments, and actually, we're heading for a 2.7 degree increase. So nations need to up the ante in their plans radically. To say there's a lot at stake here in Glasgow is an understatement. The science tells us what needs to be done, and we'll see in the halls behind me over the next 2 weeks if national leaderships have what it takes to step up. The world is overheating, and extreme weather is already hitting hard. And to demonstrate the importance of this conference, we return to Evia in Greece, scene of those devastating wildfires in the summer, where they're still picking up the pieces.
In early August, with temperatures at unseen highs, wildfires ripped across southern Europe. The land was parched and the fires quickly spread. Northern Evia in Greece was the hardest hit. The inferno lasted for 2 weeks. Thousands were evacuated. Today you can see what's left. The devastation in this area was total. People are well used to annual wildfires here, but not on this scale, not with this much lost. Thousands of hectares of forest and livelihoods just incinerated. And because of the fires, a new threat. As the rain comes, so do floods and mudslides.
The fires have destroyed the land's natural ability to withhold water, to act as a flood defence system. So now, in periods of intense rain, the water just cascades off these hillsides.
So they're using the dead trees to shore up the soil and keep the land intact. It is hard, exhausting work, but vital to preserve what's left and encourage regeneration of the forest. a big part of Evia's forest economy has been obliterated. Costas Ioniou's livelihood comes from his bees, who make honey from the resin of pine trees, or used to.
I feel sad that this once green forest has been burnt, and I find it difficult to figure out what we'll do and how beekeeping can continue to exist on Evia. We will not be around when this forest is once again able to give us honey, so for us, our area has died.
Collecting pine resin was an important money earner for farmers like Georgios Agnostou, but not anymore. He also lost a fifth of his goat herd to the fires. Across the island, more animals died than survived.
The destruction was great for farmers. Buildings were burnt, animals were lost, and grazing land has disappeared. In other words, what we had here was lost. Many years need to go by so that things can return to how they were.
Helping people around the world to adapt to and mitigate against catastrophic events like this is a big part of the climate conference in Glasgow. So what does success at COP26 look like? The science tells us we need to prevent temperatures from rising beyond ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius. But the 2021 Production Gap report shows that current government plans will produce more than double the amount of fossil fuels required to make that happen. So, in Glasgow, we need a strong declaration that commits to net zero emissions by 2050, as well as big reductions by 2030. This has been a seismic event that has changed lives, perhaps for a generation. But the forest will come back, because nature always does, if humanity allows it to.
Amongst the major announcements at the G20 summit on Saturday were the introduction of a flat tax of 15% for all companies earning over $890 million a year. This is an effort by the leaders of the G20 to do away with tax havens and to prevent some of the world's biggest economies from setting up tax-free or very reduced tax limits in countries that don't charge much when they should be paying more tax in their countries of origin. This was a measure that was already ratified by the G7 finance ministers back in July. It's now been accepted by the G20 leaders at the summit here in Rome. The second measure announced today was a joint statement by the leaders of France, Germany, the United Kingdom and the United States towards Iran. They want Iran to come back to the negotiating table to try to work out an agreement on the Iranian nuclear deal. Iran has been stalling those discussions since the election of Ibrahim Raisi back in June. And they have now said they're willing to come back to the negotiating table. This is something that the West wants them to do, and they're showing a joint approach towards that. This is a measure to show that the United States is back with the West in wanting Iran to move forward with its plans to get this deal up and running now the United States is back in it. And the other important issues, of course, which are being discussed here are climate change, which will carry on once the COP26 gets underway in Glasgow on Monday. More effort required to bring down global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade by the end of the 21st century, to do away with coal fires and fossil fuel energy, and more effort being made to help the poorer countries of the world to deal with global warming by handing over $100 billion in aid, which has already been promised, but which is very slow in making its way to those countries. And the coronavirus pandemic was also on the list of the important topics being discussed here at the G20 on Saturday. The coronavirus pandemic, where the nation's leaders are saying more efforts also needed to give money to the developing world to introduce vaccines so that only 3% so far who are vaccinated can be brought up to the same level as the industrialized world, i.e. 60% of people vaccinated. All of those measures discussed today at the G20 summit, more discussions going ahead on Sunday.
Cari ascoltatori della BBC, buongiorno. Il cambiamento climatico e la pandemia da Covid-19 mettono a nudo la radicale vulnerabilità di tutti e tutto suscitano numerosi dubbi e perplessità sui nostri sistemi economici e sulle modalità di organizzazione delle nostre società. Le nostre sicurezze sono crollate, il nostro appetito di potere e la nostra smania di controllo si stanno sgretolando. Ci siamo scoperti deboli e pieni di paure, immersi in una serie di crisi sanitarie, ambientali, alimentari, economiche, sociali, umanitarie, etiche. Crisi trasversali, fortemente interconnesse e foriere di una tempesta perfetta, capace di spezzare i legami che avviluppano la nostra società all'interno del dono prezioso del creato. Ogni crisi richiede visione, capacità di pianificazione e rapidità di esecuzione, ripensando il futuro della nostra casa comune e del nostro progetto comune. Queste crisi ci mettono di fronte a scelte radicali non facili. Ogni momento di difficoltà racchiude infatti anche delle opportunità che non possono essere sprecate. Possono essere affrontate facendo prevalere atteggiamenti di isolamento, protezionismo, sfruttamento, oppure possono rappresentare una vera occasione di trasformazione, un vero punto di conversione, non solo in senso spirituale. Quest'ultima via è la sola che conduce verso un orizzonte luminoso e può essere perseguita solo attraverso una rinnovata corresponsabilità mondiale, una nuova solidarietà fondata sulla giustizia, sulla condivisione di un comune destino e sulla coscienza dell'unità della famiglia umana, progetto di Dio per il mondo. Si tratta di una sfida di civiltà a favore del bene comune e di un cambiamento di prospettiva nella mente e nello sguardo che deve porre al centro di ogni nostra azione la dignità di tutti gli esseri umani di oggi e di domani. La lezione più importante che queste crisi ci trasmettono è che è necessario costruire insieme, perché non vi sono frontiere, barriere, mura politiche entro le quali potersi nascondere. E lo sappiamo, da una crisi non si esce da soli. Qualche giorno fa, il 4 ottobre, ero riunito con capi religiosi e scienziati per firmare un appello congiunto che richiamasse ad azioni più responsabili e coerenti sia noi stessi che i nostri governanti. In quell'occasione mi ha colpito la testimonianza di una delle scienziati che ha detto: «La mia nipotina appena nata entro 50 anni dovrà abitare in un mondo inabitabile se le cose sono così». Non lo possiamo permettere. È fondamentale l'impegno di ciascuno verso quel cambio di rotta così tanto urgente, impegno che va alimentato anche dalla propria fede e spiritualità. Nell'appello congiunto abbiamo richiamato la necessità di adoperarci responsabilmente a favore della cultura della cura, della nostra casa comune e anche di noi stessi, cercando di estirpare i semi dei conflitti che sono avidità, indifferenza, ignoranza, paura, ingiustizia, insicurezza e violenza. L'umanità non ha mai avuto tanti mezzi per giungere a tale obiettivo quanti ne ha oggi. I decisori politici che prenderanno parte alla COP26 di Glasgow sono chiamati con urgenza a offrire efficaci risposte alla crisi ecologica in cui viviamo e, in questo modo, concreta speranza alle generazioni future. Ma tutti noi, è bene ripeterlo, chiunque e ovunque siamo, possiamo avere un ruolo nel modificare la nostra risposta collettiva alla minaccia senza precedenti del cambiamento climatico e del degrado della nostra casa comune.
durande dug yoro koyne gani irikis be hayka dindin gaw dindi hayka hinka to moto o daga ko ndani ga moydo wo ka go farne mo di hinka faru mo di far jeje ka farke ki ko to non bode zumbuta fo ko be gidi ni ga tasude wo yoro guna ga cebo bi dem
كده غاشدك لسانا كيس غاشدك المشامي في ربها مدام ما يكشي شكته ويلا غاشلي زغا موسمي دن مشامي اجنا ودا تجم كونا غي شكتي يجلني كده قيام ودورتي تلي سواعنا قيمة ابنكم
Regardez comment la couleur de notre terre a changé, tantôt rouge, tantôt noir, tantôt des grains, tu vois. Le gaz a brûlé toute la terre. Ça, c'est quelque chose que les arbres, la terre a changé de couleur.
C'est une école d'à peu près 400 élèves. 400 élèves, cela veut dire toute une génération perdue. Une génération préparée pour l'exode ou bien pour le recrutement. Mais malheureusement, il y a une force plus forte que nous. Depuis 2012, nos communes n'existent qu'avec l'appui des partenaires humanitaires et des partenaires au développement.
Overnight, the brunt of the bomb cyclone arrived, hammering the Pacific Northwest in a historic fashion. 41 million people in the path of what forecasters are calling the most powerful storm ever recorded off the West Coast. Just outside of Seattle, 2 people tragically killed when a tree landed on their vehicle. Near Tobin, California, landslides wreaking havoc on this typically picturesque highway. Burn scars from record-breaking wildfires carving out pathways for debris to flow.
The debris flow is a concern as well, but also down trees are a huge concern, down power lines. Even if a tree doesn't land on your house per se.
Whipping winds up to 65 miles per hour, tearing down scaffolding in San Francisco. Whistling through the Golden Gate Bridge. And toppling trees onto homes.
Basically, the whole roof is collapsed and exposed to the weather on the inside.
For months, California farmers have hoped for rain, gripped by one of the worst droughts on record. Sacramento has not seen a drop since March, but this kind of rain, falling more than an inch an hour in some areas, is proving disastrous.
A week ago, we were saying the drought, we've got no water, we're running out of water, we've got to have more water. And here we are a week later going, too much water.
Evacuations ordered in areas at greatest risk, but some opting to wait out the storm, praying they'll be spared. The bomb cyclone bringing record-breaking rain to communities like here in San Francisco. Climate experts say it's not enough to end California's drought, but it should help.
All right. Emily Akeda for us there in San Francisco. Emily, thanks.
And that just gets us started on the triple threat that's going on across the country today, Al.
Yeah, guys, and when you talk about rain, I mean, Sacramento had gone 218 days without rain, and now we're talking about 7 million people with flood and mudslide risks continuing this morning. Rainfall rates of up to an inch per hour. There's heavy rain coming in. You can also see snow in the Sierra, and that's going to be at least good news, helping to build up that snowpack. But we've got wind warnings as well, gusts of over 70 miles per hour, and tree damage. Power outages possible. Up to 8 to 10 inches of rain still possible across northern California, of course, leading to more flooding. And we're looking at 2 to 3 feet of snow stretching from Susanville all the way down to Mammoth Lakes and further south. So that's a good news thing kind of for their drought as we look ahead. Now, here in the east, 16 million people at risk for severe weather, damaging winds, hail, and isolated threat for tornadoes from Roanoke, Norfolk, Charlotte, all the way to Huntington. And we're looking at a flood risk today. 31 million people here in the Northeast, all the way into New England, starting tonight through Tuesday with that heavy rain. Here comes a big storm system, cold front pushing in. That's going to bring heavy rain into the Northeast, plus wind gusts of up to 30 to 40 miles per hour. We're also watching this heavy rain along the coast, anywhere up to 3 to 4 inches of rain. And tomorrow, our friends in the Midwest are going to be under the gun for severe weather. 8 million people from Salina, Kansas, all the way down to San Angelo, Texas.
Streets in downtown Philadelphia turned into rivers. Some drivers had to retreat to the roofs of their cars as floodwaters quickly rose. The slow-moving storm brought intense downpours for several hours from Virginia to New Jersey. Heavy winds, too, up to 80-kilometer-per-hour gusts.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy.
Kayakers paddled through flooded streets in downtown Annapolis as Maryland's governor declared a state of emergency. Meteorologists say the flooding was caused by astronomically high so-called king tides brought on by human-induced climate change. Unfortunately, this is becoming all too normal.
See the water lines in the businesses every now and then, but they're used to it. It's just, you know, they're like, yeah, we're used to it. We do this, we move on, and we clean it up and start all over again.
Can we get more than 5?
Business owners in parts of Virginia put out sandbags to protect their goods, too. The ground became so wet, huge trees in the U.S. Capitol came tumbling down. Some restaurants opened Friday, then had to quickly shut down.
Somebody was telling me they were out at Pirates Cove restaurant and they had to close. The water was coming up as they were sitting on the dock eating.
The Potomac River rose so high, this man was actually fishing along the George Washington Parkway. Flooding in some areas reached record-breaking levels, leaving D.C. meteorologist Bill Cairns to tweet, "Wild that this no-name storm will likely break the all-time highest water level ever recorded on the Delaware Bay." Experts say coastal cities and towns are seeing more and more major flooding from meager storm systems, another costly and dangerous result of climate change. Jennifer Johnson, Global News, Washington.
Autumn carpets the hillsides, the multi-hued canopy marking the seasonal change of millennia. Ancient original forests sweeping across the Carpathian Mountains in Eastern Europe.
If the Amazon rainforest is the lungs of the world, then the forests of the Carpathian Mountains are the lungs of Europe. They suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere and put oxygen back into it. They regulate the water system. There's a vast, vast array of life here. In fact, the forests of the world are the most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet.
But in this once pristine environment, life is being squeezed out by the so-called timber mafia. Trees are being extracted illegally on an unprecedented scale by criminal gangs, and the locals who fight against it pay the price. Beatings are frequent, but people are murdered too. 6 forest rangers have been killed in the last few years, leading to recent protests in the capital, Bucharest. Forester Horia Petrus mimics the call of a red stag. He tells me there used to be 50 or 60 in this area alone. And this is why. This area was illegally logged 10 years ago, and it ripped apart the ecosystem.
You can see this kind of devastation from the moon. On the satellite maps, you can see everything. It's impossible to believe that they didn't know. They know, and they encourage, and they took a lot of money.
Horia says it's clear who's to blame.
The politicians.
We spoke to the government, and they told us,
combating illegal logging is one of the priorities of Romania. It's a continuous action, and we've already seen results.
For the people who live in the mountains, it's terrible.
For hundreds of years we have managed the forest in a sustainable way. We take a small amount of wood for building and fire. It's very annoying that strangers come here from other countries and take away our way of life. I'm frightened of the people who steal the wood. I feel my family is in danger because this is a mob-like organization.
The scale of loss is staggering. Romania loses up to 9 hectares of forest per hour to illegal logging. That contributes to the huge amount of forests lost globally. In fact, between 1990 and 2016, the world lost 1.3 million square kilometers of forest, an area larger than South Africa. And in 2020, tropical forest loss around the world equaled the size of the Netherlands. Since humans started cutting down forests, 46% of trees have been felled. Around the world, 2020 was meant to be a landmark year in the fight against deforestation, a year by which many countries had pledged to halve or completely stop forest loss. But in fact, the plundering has increased. Here in Romania, it's not too late yet. But if not now, when? Nick Clark, Al Jazeera, Carpathian Mountains, Romania.
Okay, let's bring in Talis Carvalho-Resende, who's an expert at the UNESCO World Heritage Centre. He joins us live from Paris. Thanks for joining us, Talis. Can you tell us, it seems counterintuitive that these World Heritage forests are actually carbon emitters. Can you explain how that's happened?
Yeah, indeed. We did this very first analysis in which we were able to quantify the amount of carbon that is absorbed and released from World Heritage forests. We were kind of surprised, both positively and negatively, of the results. We found out that indeed World Heritage forests are a large carbon sink, absorbing 190 million tons of CO2 per year. That's more or less half of the UK's annual emissions from fossil fuels. But also, unfortunately, that 10 World Heritage forests have emitted more carbon than captured. And the reasons, I would say, are mainly land use pressures, but also climate change.
That is concerning. And tell us why the Carpathian Mountains are bucking that trend and managing to suck up much of Europe's CO2 gases. Why is that the case?
Well, I guess the case of the Carpathians is something that can be seen all around the world. No, in times of climate change, the capacity of forests to absorb carbon can be reduced. And what is alarming is the fact that in the future, more sites can be at risk because of this.
So how big of a problem is deforestation globally, and how can we at all reverse these issues that we've created?
Well, actually, what struck us more in this study was the impacts of climate-related events. For instance, wildfires. We have seen unprecedented wildfires over the past few years, which, for instance, one single wildfire released more CO2 emissions than a country per year. And this is quite alarming because it's a vicious cycle, no? As you have more higher temperatures, this means more wildfires, more CO2 emissions, and then more CO2 emissions, again, higher temperatures. So it's a vicious cycle that can be very dangerous.
Yes, and we keep getting the same message over and over again about climate change. Thank you for your insights, Talis Carvalho-Resende. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. Have a very good day.